who shows total disregard for anything and anyone who doesn't satisfy his lusts and his desires. When we were rehearsing that role, as I said, I'm in my 30s, and I'm singing the title role of Don Giovanni, of Not Too Close to God. God has a wonderful sense of humor, because when we were rehearsing in a Methodist church's chancel area. We were rehearsing this womanizer's life in this area. We were bringing all this decadence into this area. One night during that period of time, I called home and I said, Pamela, I don't know what's going on, but I just had a conversation with some of these folks in the opera here, and we were talking about philosophy and religion and, you know, all this kind of stuff, and I just came to realize, Pamela, that I don't know diddly squat about nothing. But I think God is calling me into the ministry. Now, there is some humor in that, folks. I don't know diddly squat about diddly squat. I couldn't talk about their religions or their philosophies or their theologies. But I believe God was calling me into the ministry. Now, you work it out. Did I tell you that God and Jesus are persistent? Anyway. I had that conversation. And she said, Actually, that's about all she said. But I got home. And before I got home, which was maybe about 2 weeks later than that, I got home and the news had spread throughout Bonner Springs. Mick's going into the ministry. Mick's going to become a pastor. Can you believe that? No. Can you believe that? No. Can you believe that? No. Mick's going into the ministry. And presto chango, here I am. Just like that. Okay. I know, I need to tell them a little bit more of the story. Back off, dude. Man, talk about being persistent. Actually, there is more to the story. Because during seminary, and I said during seminary, I had what is so affectionately called by some a come to Jesus moment. Have you ever heard of come to Jesus moment? Have you ever had your come to Jesus moment? Well, I had mine in seminary. Okay, you had your come to Jesus moment in seminary, and you were going to seminary to become a pastor, but you didn't know Jesus before you went to seminary, so how did you know you were going to become a pastor if you don't know Jesus and you're already started seminary? I'll let you work that out, folks. But it began with 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 18 through 25, and actually it centered on verse 18. For the message of the cross is foolishness to those of us who are perishing, but to those of us who are being saved, For the cross, the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. I didn't get past that moment, folks. I did not get past that moment. Because I was one of those who was perishing. I was one of those who was lost and broken, living in my sin and my pain of my brokenness. I was lost. To be honest with you, I cannot tell you much about what happened in the next 9 months. Because I entered a darkness and a deep despair that I have never felt and never want to feel again, thanks be to God and Jesus Christ. I can only tell you this as I reflect back. It was my come to Jesus moment. It was that moment in time when God kind of said, yes, I am calling you. Isn't that nice to know that God calls? God calls all of us. He said, yes, I am calling you. And maybe you will preach someday. Maybe someday you will preach. But first, meet my son. I want you to know my son, God said. I don't want you to know philosophies and theologies and this and that. I want you to know my son. And I got to know Jesus in a very intimate and personal and wonderful way. One of our seminary assignments was to embrace the tradition of another denomination, to compare and contrast. And I embraced the early black church. You talk about a faithful people. I learned about the invisible institution where the people that were held in the captivity and the sinfulness of slavery would meet for worship. I learned how they would put wet blankets up on trees to create a sanctuary. And they would hold their worship within these wet blankets hung on trees. And the reason they were wet is not only to create the sanctuary, but to dampen the sound so that the white slave owner could not hear them worship. And I learned about how they would fill this big kettle of water. You know, the massa, as they were called back then, thought that they were just cooking. But the people would fill the pots with water, and the preacher would come over and he would bend over the pot and he would preach the word into the pot. And the reason he would preach the word into the pot is because he would be telling them this story. He would, but then all of a sudden they knew that he was preaching a gospel of liberation. He was preaching the story about Jesus who came to set the captive free. He said, no, you are not held in bondage anymore. You belong to me. And they were set free during that time. I learned about this early church. I learned about how the preacher, the black preacher who would come into those communities of faith, and he would preach God's word of hope, God's words of freedom, words of a promised land, just